The Shadow in the Woods. Jenna had always loved the outdoors. Growing up in a small town surrounded by forests, she spent her childhood exploring the woods near her home. So, when she got a job as a park ranger in a large national park, she was thrilled. The park was beautiful with dense forests, clear lakes, and miles of hiking trails. It felt like a dream come true. Her first few months on the job were uneventful. She spent her days patrolling the trails, helping lost hikers and making sure the park stayed clean. She made friends with the other rangers and felt like she belonged. But as summer turned to fall, things began to change. It started with the animals. Jenna noticed that the wildlife in the park was acting strange. Deer and rabbits that used to be common sightings were suddenly scarce. Birds no longer sang in the mornings. One day, she found a raccoon dead near her cabin, its body covered in strange marks. It was unsettling, but she brushed it off, thinking it was just a coincidence. Then came the disappearances. 2 hikers went missing on the same trail within a week. Jenna joined the search parties, scouring the woods for any sign of them. They found nothing. No tracks, no belongings, not even a hint of where they might have gone. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. The park was put on high alert. More rangers were brought in and the trails were closely monitored, but the disappearances continued. Every few weeks, another hiker would go missing. Each time, the search parties came back empty-handed. Rumors began to spread among the rangers. Some said the park was cursed, others whispered about an old legend of a creature that lived in the woods. Jenna didn't believe in curses or creatures, but she couldn't deny that something was wrong. She decided to do some investigating on her own. One night, after everyone else had gone to bed, she grabbed her flashlight and set off into the woods. She followed the trail where most of the disappearances had occurred, determined to find some clue, some explanation for what was happening. The woods were eerily quiet. The only sound was the crunch of leaves under her boots. She walked for hours, shining her flashlight into the darkness, but found nothing. Just as she was about to turn back, she heard a noise, a soft rustling like someone or something moving through the trees. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. "Is anyone there?" There was no answer, but the rustling grew louder. She followed the sound, her heart pounding. The trees seemed to close in around her, the darkness growing thicker. Suddenly, she stumbled into a clearing. In the center of the clearing was an old, dilapidated cabin. It looked like it hadn't been used in years. She approached the cabin cautiously. The door was ajar, hanging off its hinges. She pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was cold and musty. She shone her flashlight around the room, but it was empty, just a few pieces of broken furniture and a thick layer of dust. As she turned to leave, she noticed something on the floor. It was a piece of cloth, torn and dirty. She picked it up and realized it was part of a hiking jacket. Her heart sank. This was the first sign of the missing hikers she had found. She heard the rustling again, this time much closer. She turned around and saw a shadow moving in the doorway. The beam of her flashlight flickered as she pointed it at the figure. It was a man, tall and thin, his clothes ragged and dirty. His eyes were wild and he had a crazed look on his face. "Who are you?" Jenna demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. The man didn't answer. Instead, he took a step towards her. Jenna backed away, her heart racing. She could see now that his hands were covered in dirt and dried blood. "Stay back!" she shouted, but the man kept coming. She turned and ran, bursting out of the cabin and into the woods. She could hear the man behind her crashing through the underbrush. She ran faster, her flashlight bouncing wildly in her hand. She didn't stop until she reached the ranger station. She burst through the door, gasping for breath. Her colleagues looked up in surprise. "Jenna, what's wrong?" one of them asked. "There's a man in the woods," she panted. "He's covered in blood. I think he's the one behind the disappearances." The rangers sprang into action. They grabbed their gear and headed out into the woods, Jenna leading the way. They searched the area around the cabin but found no sign of the man. It was as if he had vanished, just like the missing hikers. Over the next few days, the park was combed from end to end. Extra patrols were set up and the trails were closed to the public. But no one found the mysterious man Jenna had seen. The disappearances stopped, and life in the park slowly returned to normal. But Jenna couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching, waiting. One night, a few weeks later, Jenna was on patrol when she heard the rustling again. She froze, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The rustling grew louder and she felt a chill run down her spine. She turned to run, but something grabbed her arm. She screamed and swung her flashlight, hitting something solid. She broke free and ran, not stopping until she reached the safety of the ranger station. She burst through the door, her heart pounding. "What happened?" one of the rangers asked. "Something grabbed me," Jenna gasped. "Out in the woods. I think it's the man. He's still out there." The rangers grabbed their gear and headed out into the woods. They searched for hours but found nothing. Jenna was shaken, but she knew she couldn't let fear control her. She had to find out what was happening. The next night, she went back into the woods, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. She followed the trail to the cabin, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The cabin was empty, just as it had been before. She searched the area, but found no sign of the man. As she turned to leave, she heard the rustling again. She spun around, her flashlight beam bouncing off the trees. The sound was coming from the other side of the clearing. She took a deep breath and walked towards it, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached the edge of the clearing and saw something that made her blood run cold. There, hanging from the trees, were the bodies of the missing hikers. Their eyes were open, staring blankly into the night. Jenna felt a scream rise in her throat, but she couldn't make a sound. She turned and ran, her flashlight bouncing wildly in her hand. She didn't stop until she reached the ranger station. She burst through the door, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. "They're dead," she gasped, "all of them, hanging from the trees." The rangers sprang into action. They grabbed their gear and headed out into the woods. Jenna led them to the clearing, her heart pounding in her chest, but when they arrived, the bodies were gone. The trees were empty and there was no sign of the man. The rangers searched the area but found nothing. Jenna was shaken, but she knew she couldn't give up. She had to find out what was happening. Over the next few days, Jenna spent every waking moment searching the woods. She followed every lead, no matter how small. But the man remained elusive and the disappearances continued. One night, as Jenna was on patrol, she heard the rustling again. She froze, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The rustling grew louder, and she felt a chill run down her spine. She turned to run, but something grabbed her arm. She screamed and swung her flashlight, hitting something solid. She broke free and ran, not stopping until she reached the safety of the ranger station. She burst through the door, her heart pounding. "What happened?" one of the rangers asked. "Something grabbed me," Jenna gasped. "Out in the woods. I think it's the man. He's still out there." The rangers grabbed their gear and headed out into the woods. They searched for hours but found nothing. Jenna was shaken, but she knew she couldn't let fear control her. She had to find out what was happening. The next night she went back into the woods, determined to get to the bottom of the mystery. She followed the trail to the cabin, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The cabin was empty, just as it had been before. She searched the area, but found no sign of the man. As she turned to leave, she heard the rustling again. She spun around, her flashlight beam bouncing off the trees. The sound was coming from the other side of the clearing. She took a deep breath and walked towards it, her heart pounding in her chest. She reached the edge of the clearing and saw something that made her blood run cold. There, hanging from the trees, were the bodies of the missing hikers. Their eyes were open, staring blankly into the night. Jenna felt a scream rise in her throat, but she couldn't make a sound. She turned and ran, her flashlight bouncing wildly in her hand. She didn't stop until she reached the ranger station. She burst through the door, her face pale and her eyes wide with terror. "They're dead," she gasped. "All of them, hanging from the trees." The rangers sprang into action. They grabbed their gear and headed out into the woods. Jenna led them to the clearing, her heart. The Unseen Guest, Chapter 1, A New Beginning. Lisa and Mike had been looking for the perfect house for months. When they found the charming two-story home in the quiet town of Oakwood, it seemed too good to be true. The house was old, with a rustic charm that Lisa loved, and it came at an unbeatable price. They moved in with their 6-year-old daughter, Emily, excited to start their new life. The first few weeks were blissful. The neighborhood was friendly, the school was great, and the house felt like a dream come true. But then, strange things started happening. It began with small, easily dismissed occurrences: doors left open, lights flickering, and misplaced items. Lisa assumed it was just the stress of moving and adjusting to a new place. But then Emily started talking about her new friend. "Mommy, I was playing with Sarah today," Emily said one evening at dinner. "Who's Sarah?" Lisa asked, confused. She hadn't met any of the neighborhood kids yet. "She lives here," Emily said, smiling. "She's really nice." Lisa exchanged a puzzled look with Mike. They decided it was just Emily's imagination and left it at that. Chapter 2. The Shadow. One night, while Mike was away on a business trip, Lisa woke up to a strange sound. It was a soft humming, like a lullaby. She got out of bed and followed the sound to Emily's room. Emily was fast asleep, but the humming continued. It seemed to be coming from the closet. Lisa slowly opened the closet door, but there was nothing there. The humming stopped abruptly. She shook her head, blaming it on fatigue, and went back to bed. The next day, Emily seemed unusually quiet. When Lisa asked her what was wrong, Emily just shrugged and said, "Sarah doesn't want to play anymore." Lisa felt a chill run down her spine. She decided to do some research on the house, hoping to find some logical explanation for the strange occurrences. She went to the local library and dug into the town's history. What she found made her blood run cold. The house had belonged to a family named the Bakers, who had mysteriously disappeared one night in the 1950s. Their daughter Sarah was never found. Chapter 3. The Haunting. Lisa tried to dismiss the unsettling information, but the strange occurrences only intensified. She heard footsteps when no one was there, objects moved on their own, and Emily's behavior grew more and more erratic. One evening, Lisa found Emily sitting in her room, staring at the wall. "Emily, honey, what are you doing?" Lisa asked. "Talking to Sarah," Emily replied, not taking her eyes off the wall. Lisa felt a surge of panic. "Emily, there's no one there." "Yes, there is," Emily insisted. "She's right here. She says she doesn't like you." That night, Lisa and Mike decided it was time to get professional help. They contacted a local paranormal investigator named Jack, who agreed to come over and check the house. Jack arrived the next day with his equipment. He set up cameras, motion sensors, and audio recorders throughout the house. As night fell, they gathered in the living room, waiting for something to happen. At first, it was quiet. Then, around midnight, the temperature in the room dropped suddenly. The lights flickered and a soft humming filled the air. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway. Jack grabbed his equipment and followed the noise. Lisa and Mike stayed close behind him. The footsteps led them to Emily's room. The door was slightly ajar, and they could hear Emily talking inside. Jack pushed the door open and aimed his camera at the closet. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a dark, empty space. Suddenly, Emily screamed and pointed at the closet. "There she is!" Emily cried. "She's right there!" Jack took a step back, his face pale. "I need to review the footage," he said, his voice shaking. Chapter 4. The Truth Revealed. The next morning, Jack showed Lisa and Mike the footage he had captured. On the screen, they saw a faint, ghostly figure standing in the closet. It was a young girl, her face twisted in anger. "That's Sarah," Jack said quietly. "She's still here." Lisa felt a surge of fear and guilt. They had moved into this house without knowing its dark history, and now they were trapped in a nightmare. Jack suggested a cleansing ritual to help Sarah move on. Desperate for a solution, Lisa and Mike agreed. That night, Jack performed the ritual, chanting and burning sage. The atmosphere grew tense, and the house seemed to fight back. Objects flew off shelves, lights flickered, and the temperature dropped even further. Finally, with one last chant, Jack declared the ritual complete. The house fell silent, and the oppressive feeling lifted. For the next few days, everything seemed normal. The strange occurrences stopped, and Emily stopped talking about Sarah. Lisa and Mike began to relax, thinking the worst was over. Chapter 5. The Final Night. A week later, Lisa woke up to the sound of Emily screaming. She and Mike rushed to Emily's room, but the door was locked from the inside. They could hear Emily crying and begging for help. "Mommy, Daddy, help me! She's here! She's here!" Mike kicked the door open and they found Emily cowering in the corner. The room was freezing and the closet door was wide open. A dark figure stood in the doorway, its eyes glowing with rage. "Get out!" the figure hissed. "This is my house!" Lisa grabbed Emily and ran for the door, but it slammed shut in her face. They were trapped. Mike tried to fight the figure, but it was like punching air. The figure grabbed him and threw him across the room. He hit the wall with a sickening thud and slumped to the floor, unconscious. Lisa clutched Emily, tears streaming down her face. "Please, leave us alone," she begged. The figure advanced on them, its face twisted with fury. "You will never leave," it said. "You will stay here with me forever." Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging the room into darkness. The temperature dropped even further, and Lisa could see her breath in the air. The figure loomed over them, its eyes burning with hatred. In a final, desperate act, Lisa grabbed a piece of broken mirror from the floor and slashed at the figure. It let out an ear-piercing scream and vanished, leaving the room silent and dark. Lisa rushed to Mike, who was slowly regaining consciousness. They held each other tightly, praying that the nightmare was over. But as they made their way to the door, a cold wind swept through the room. The whispering started again, louder and more menacing than ever. "You can never leave," the voice said. "You are mine." Lisa and Mike looked at each other, their faces pale with fear. They knew they could never escape the house on Oakwood Street. The unseen guest would never let them go. And so, they remained trapped in the house, their lives forever haunted by the vengeful spirit of Sarah Baker. The Forgotten Tunnel. In the small, quiet town of Millfield, there was a legend about an old, forgotten tunnel. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones about its dark history, warning children to stay away. But like all curious minds, 4 friends, Jack, Emily, Sam, and Lisa, were intrigued by the mystery and decided to explore it. One autumn afternoon, with the sun casting long shadows, they gathered at the entrance of the tunnel. It was hidden behind overgrown bushes, almost as if nature itself was trying to conceal it. The entrance was a gaping black hole, surrounded by crumbling stone. "Are we really doing this?" Lisa asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Come on, it'll be fun," Jack replied, trying to sound braver than he felt. "Besides, we'll be the first ones to see what's inside in decades." Emily and Sam exchanged nervous glances but nodded. Armed with flashlights and a sense of adventure, they stepped into the tunnel. The air inside was cold and damp, and the darkness swallowed the light from their flashlights almost completely. As they walked deeper, the entrance grew smaller until it disappeared altogether. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, winding and turning, with strange markings on the walls that none of them could decipher. "I don't like this," Emily whispered. "We should turn back." "We've come this far," Jack said. "Let's see where it leads." Suddenly they heard a noise, a faint, distant echo like a whisper carried on the wind. They stopped, holding their breath, listening intently. The whisper grew louder, more distinct. It was a voice chanting something in a language they couldn't understand. "Do you hear that?" Sam asked, his voice shaking. "Yes," Jack replied. "We should keep going. Maybe we'll find out who's making that sound." They pressed on, their footsteps echoing through the tunnel. The chanting grew louder, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from all around them, reverberating off the walls. "Look," Lisa said, pointing ahead. There was a faint light in the distance. They hurried toward it, eager to find the source of the chanting. As they approached, the light grew brighter, illuminating a large underground chamber. In the center of the chamber was an altar, covered in strange symbols. Candles flickered on the altar, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Standing around the altar were robed figures, their faces hidden in the darkness. They were chanting in unison, their voices rising and falling in a rhythmic pattern. The friends froze, terrified. "We need to leave," Emily whispered urgently. "Now!" But it was too late. The robed figures turned toward them, their chanting stopping abruptly. The sudden silence was deafening. "Who dares to enter this sacred place?" one of the figures demanded, stepping forward. His voice was deep and menacing. We didn't mean any harm, Jack stammered. We were just curious. Curiosity can be dangerous, the figure replied. You have trespassed on sacred ground. Now you must face the consequences. Before any of them could react, the robed figures moved swiftly, surrounding the friends. They tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. The figures grabbed them, pulling them toward the altar. Please let us go, Lisa cried, struggling against her captor. You cannot leave, the leader said. You have been chosen. They were forced to kneel before the altar, their hands bound with rope. The robed figures began chanting again, louder this time. The symbols on the altar seemed to glow with an unearthly light. Jack, Emily, Sam, and Lisa watched in horror as a figure emerged from the shadows, a tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a malevolent smile. He approached the altar, his eyes fixed on the friends. Welcome, he said, his voice like nails on a chalkboard. You have been chosen to be part of something greater. What do you want from us? Jack asked, his voice trembling. The man smiled, revealing sharp, pointed teeth. Your souls. The friends struggled, but the robed figures held them tight. The man began to chant, his voice joining the others. The air grew thick with a palpable sense of dread. Suddenly, the chamber shook, and the ground beneath them began to crack. Dark tendrils of shadow emerged from the cracks, wrapping around the friends, pulling them toward the altar. They screamed, but their voices were drowned out by the chanting. The man raised his hands, and the shadows tightened their grip. The friends felt a cold, piercing pain as the shadows entered their bodies, draining their life force. Their vision blurred, and darkness consumed them. When they awoke, they were no longer in the chamber. They were in a dark, featureless void with no sense of time or place. They were alone, trapped in eternal darkness. In the tunnel, the robed figures finished their ritual, and the man smiled, satisfied. The altar glowed with a dark energy, fueled by the souls of the four friends. The chamber fell silent once more, the only sound the faint, distant echo of chanting. The tunnel entrance remained hidden, waiting for the next curious souls to venture inside, unaware of the horrors that awaited them. Millfield continued to be a quiet town, the legend of the forgotten tunnel fading into obscurity. But those who listened closely could still hear the faint whispering on the wind, a warning to stay away, to leave the past undisturbed. But the warning was rarely heeded, and the tunnel waited patiently for its next victims. And so, the cycle continued, as it always had, and always would.